All right, so PowerPoint 3, the second largest PowerPoint in the entire Sochi program. We are going to talk about macronutrients today. So we are going to be starting off by talking about carbohydrates, which we're going to see the largest section of. Then we are going to move on to proteins, and then we'll finish it up. Actually, oh, that's fine. We're going in a different order. But then we're going to move on to fats, and then we'll finish it up with proteins at the end there. I'm going to change this. I'm going to change this on the slide. Fats and proteins. Does it matter? Not at all, but will it drive me insane? Absolutely. The things that matter the least often drive me the most crazy.
Right? That's funny.
So, carbohydrates, obviously a very vital part of our whole diet, right? They're critical to energy production and providing us with, an excellent source of vitamins and minerals, particularly our fat-soluble vitamins, which are like the vitamins that we're going to talk a lot about tomorrow that, act as antioxidants within our body. So like if you think of, how like certain materials get like oxidizing agents, which are commonly referred to as like free radicals, right? Those get into our system, and basically what it is, and we'll again talk more about this tomorrow, but it's this like really hungry atom that's just trying to steal electrons and energy from its surrounding environment. And unfortunately that surrounding environment is your body. So what ends up happening is your cells lose some of the atoms within your cells lose some of their electrons, and they kind of become compromised, and then your cells can't function the way that they're supposed to, and so it kind of damages your body and can sometimes even result in certain types of cancers and things like that. So carbohydrates are an excellent source of getting those minerals in your diet. So we're a big fan of carbs. They also play a vital role in exercise in that they can be metabolized for like immediate energy, which is excellent for like certain sporting events. And so these are definitely going to be something that we want to include in our diet. So carbohydrates, what are they? They are organic compounds consisting of carbon atoms with an attached oxygen and hydrogen. So carbon's going to make up the main primary like skeleton, and then you're going to have oxygen and hydrogen atoms there as well. We're typically going to classify these into two primary categories. We're going to call them simple carbohydrates, which are going to consist of like your monosaccharides. That's like a single carbohydrate itself, like a simple sugar. And then you have disaccharides, which are also considered a sugar, and those are two linked simple sugars, right? So like you have two monosaccharides that are linked together. That's a disaccharide, right? Di for the meaning two. So those are like your simple sugars, and those are really great. They taste really good, like those are the things that we like to use. So your monosaccharides that we've got glucose, which is the classic example. And you may have actually had glucose in your life. Like if you have ever run like a marathon and you've ever had like those gel packs and, squirted them in, that's straight up pre-broken down glucose, so that your digestive system is like, all right, let's break this puppy down and get it absorbed. It's already broken down straight into the bloodstream with you, So we really like glucose for immediate energy there. But we're also going to see things like fructose, right? Fructose is something that you're going to find in fruits. That is a classic like monosaccharide. That's the very simple sugar. This is why fruits taste a lot sweeter than vegetables, although vegetables sometimes have fructose in them as well. And then you're even going to see things like galactose, which is actually one of these simple sugars found in milk. Now, in your disaccharides list, right, if we're looking at two or more linked sugar molecules, we're looking at things like sucrose, which is actually where you take glucose and fructose and add them together. That's how you get sucrose. And that is like more commonly referred to as table sugar. So this is like the sugar that went into my coffee, Is it good for you? Not really. There's not a lot of reasons to actually consume sucrose other than the fact that it does supply you with carbohydrates. But as we continue moving through this and talking about carbohydrates, we're going to realize pretty quickly that there's much better versions. Like monosaccharides and disaccharides actually are very necessary in the body, but we don't really want to consume them that often. because you've already broken them down. Your digestive system doesn't really have much work to do with those things. They're very handy if you are in the middle of an intense sporting event, but if you are just sitting around the house and your glycogen stores are full, well, all that's going to do is raise your blood sugar, which is going to have some pretty negative effects actually. Other disaccharides that we've got are going to be lactose and maltose. These are also found in milk. So these three right here are all milk sugars. Lactose, by the way, is the one that if you are lactose intolerant, you're probably pretty freaking familiar with because it's probably led to a rough night or two. But lactose intolerance is actually where your digestive system is missing an enzyme that is necessary in order to be able to break down that type of sugar. And that's not even a very good description of it. What I should say instead of your body is missing it is you are not a weirdo whose body makes that enzyme. If you can drink milk, you're actually the mutants here. Milk drinkers are basically like people who develop this special enzyme to be able to break that down. It's not something that was originally occurring in humans, which is kind of fun. So then we also have our complex carbohydrates. Your complex carbohydrates are made of 3 or more linked simple sugars. Like we talked about yesterday, you have what are called oligosaccharides, which is like 3 to 7 linked carbohydrates. And then you have like polysaccharides, which are like 11 or more. But honestly, they're all just going to kind of fall under the complex umbrella once they hit the number 3 and above. So obviously there's ones that are like way more complex and there's some that are less, but for the most part, we're just going to call those complex carbs. Now, complex carbs are going to exist primarily in 2 major categories, which we're going to call starch and glycogen. Now, starches, there's a ton of different examples, right? Different starches in foods. Let's see here if I can actually find a good example of this. I don't want different starchy foods. I want things like pectin and amylose. Yeah, so you're going to see like different, there we go. No, that's actually not what I'm looking for. Come on. I'm sure it's actually probably in these articles here. I'm just using Google Images, which is not always the best source. So here's like really 2 different versions of starches that are out there. You can see they have just slightly different structures. This is amylose and this is amylopectin, and then there's also just straight up pectin. And those are different starches that exist. Those starches are really important when you consider like cooking. Like there's a difference between like regular like white potatoes and sweet potatoes, and then there's a difference between like russet potatoes and red potatoes. There's a bunch of different versions there. Those are all the different types of starches that you're going to find. But at the end of the day, a starch is a starch, right? They're big chains of carbohydrates. So what a starch is it's a naturally existing carbohydrate synthesized by plants. Now, another example of a complex carbohydrate is glycogen. And glycogen isn't what you're going to find in plants. Glycogen is the storage form of carbohydrates in our bodies. So in animals, right, we are able to store glycogen inside of like our liver and throughout all of our muscles. And what's great about that is if you haven't eaten in a couple hours, but you do need to produce anaerobic metabolism and you need to work really, really, really hard, your body can actually release that glycogen into your bloodstream to raise your blood sugar levels. Now, whenever that happens, that also triggers like a lot of hormones that create like hunger because your body's like, all right, I will give you these carbs, but you have to promise to give me new ones in exchange, And that's usually why you get a little hangry if you haven't eaten in a few hours, because your body is tapping into that source. So glycogen is going to be considered a starch because its chemical makeup is actually very, very, very similar to that of these other complex carbohydrates that we see. In fact, the easiest way to kind of picture it is if you picture boiling a pot of potatoes and that scum that's like seeping on the top there, that's actually kind of what glycogen looks like inside our bodies. This is kind of wet, sticky carbohydrate hidden in our liver and muscles. What's up, Frankie?
How come like sweet potatoes are better for you than just like your standard potato? What makes them so much different?
So this is where we're getting into that like little bit of talk that is very nutrition specific where I don't really like to
Yeah.
use the term better
Yeah.
because like the thing about sweet potatoes is they are actually higher in sugars. So let's take a look here. I'm going to pull up both potatoes. Let's look up a russet potato nutrition. That's like the classic, Idaho potato.
Yep.
And then, you know what? Actually, hold on. I want to. Google's got a really good resource here if I can find them. Potato nutrition facts. Come on, Google, help me. There it is. All right. So here's Google's like potato stuff here, right? So I'm gonna switch this to 100 grams of potatoes, and then let's open up another one here and change that to sweet potato. Nice. Okay, there's sweet potatoes, right? And we'll also do 100 grams here. So you look at 100 grams of both of these, right? So if you were to eat the exact same amount of each of these, you're actually going to find in like your kind of classic regular old potato, 77 calories in the regular potato, and you're going to find 86 calories in the sweet potato. So it's actually higher in calories. Fat content's about the same, cholesterol content's the same. Sodium is actually lower in regular potatoes and higher in sweet potatoes. And same with potassium there. Potassium is going to be higher in regular and lower in sweet potatoes. And then if you look at the carbohydrate content, 20 grams of carbohydrates with 3 grams of fiber and 4 grams of sugar versus regular potatoes, which only have 17 grams, but they have less fiber content, right? They have slightly less fiber content, but they have massively less sugar content.
Yeah.
And then protein wise, you're going to see 1.6 grams. You're going to see like 2 grams over here. So you always hear like sweet potatoes are high in protein. They're lower in protein than regular potatoes.
Yeah, that's weird.
So I'm not saying that like regular potatoes are better, but here's the big difference, right? If we look at like the vitamin C content of a regular potato, you're getting like 32% versus like 4%. But then if you look at the vitamin A content, you're getting 0% versus a massive 283%. So vitamin A has been linked to, vitamin A is acting as one of our antioxidants, and it has been shown to be very, very important inside the body, like for your skin health, for your eye health, for a lot of like protein utilization purposes. So, vitamin A is super, super important. Now, if you're getting plenty of vitamin A in your diet from other sources, like maybe you're getting plenty of carrots in your diet or beets or things like that, then you're doing pretty well. You don't really need to have sweet potatoes in your diet. You can honestly be better off eating a regular potato because it's going to have like a higher fiber a lower fiber content, but less sugar,
Yeah.
So are sweet potatoes actually better? I don't know. I think like in a lot of cases they can be. If I was vitamin A deficient, I need to get on a sweet potato diet right away. You're going to
But
find
if you're,
certain types of vitamin complexes in sweet potatoes that you're not going to find in regular, but then in the opposite spectrum, it totally flips. It just depends on what you need.
yeah, because if I'm like juicing beets and carrots every day, I'm getting plenty of vitamin A. Then I
Totally.
can eat standard potatoes and get the
Exactly.
things that I'm missing and less sugar.
Totally. And this is the thing, like this is where nutrition's complicated. A is a fat soluble vitamin. So what happens if you eat like a ton of vitamin A, like you have a whole bunch of sweet potatoes and you're trying to be super healthy, so you don't put any you don't use any butter on those sweet potatoes. You eat like some totally like starchy, great healthy well, actually, sorry, the sweet potato would be your good starch. Let's say you get like a really good vegetable in there as well, like green beans that you don't put anything on. They're just totally, raw green beans, cooked but raw. And then like get a super lean, like super, super, super lean chicken breast, right? Like no fat on it at all. Well, that's kind of cool. You got a super low fat, healthy carb, high vitamin meal, but all those vitamins, which are fat soluble, can't even get into your bloodstream because you didn't absorb enough fat in your diet. Now, your body actually has like bile and stuff, which has like some fat in it itself. So it actually can assist in that absorption. So I'm not saying you're not going to get any of those vitamins, but like one of the mistakes that a lot of people make when it comes to juicing is they'll make this like super, awesome like fruit and vegetable smoothie, which is packed full of vitamins. And so it's like, but the only nutrient you're going to find in there is carbohydrates, right? It's full carbs, no fat, no protein. And there's a lot of water content in there, you know, because there's a lot of water content in vegetables. So the B vitamins might get into your bloodstream, but those fat soluble ones might struggle. So throwing in like a tablespoon of olive oil, now suddenly you're giving your body some fats, which can carry those vitamins into your bloodstream. And that's what we're going to look at when we get to fats in this PowerPoint here. But this is where nutrition is so complicated. So I don't really like to say like sweet potatoes are better, and I also don't like to say they're worse. I think that if you need them, you need them, and if you don't, you don't. You know?
Yeah, for sure. So you're saying like when I do juice, it is a good idea to put like a tablespoon of olive oil inside my juice?
I love doing that. That's like one of my favorite hacks, actually.
That's
That
I
or just
never
throw
thought about
avocado.
that.
What's that?
I said I never thought about that.
That
I'm
or
gonna do that from now on.
yeah, man. If you get some avocado in there, I mean that's high fat, you know.
Yeah.
Or eat it with like some nuts or something, you know. Like if you use like nut milk that has like fat in it and stuff, that's also really good. But yeah, that's why like they looked at there was a study that came out like a year and a half, 2 years ago, and they were looking at like the nutrient absorption of like salads. And some of the salads were using like oil-based dressings, and so their calorie content was obviously much higher. And so immediately people were like, "Oh, that's the unhealthy salad." And then they were looking at like another salad that had like a different type of dressing that had lower calories but didn't have any fat in it. And they were finding that like the nutrient absorption in group A was much higher than the nutrient absorption in group B.
Yeah, makes sense.
Yeah, right. And then the
Yep.
other thing is true too. If you don't get enough water, well, you're screwed on your B vitamin, you know, your water soluble vitamins.
Yeah.
And at the same time, this is where, I mean, this is just a classic nutrition conversation. Look at the other, like, you know, what's the number one piece of advice people give you when you're sick, when you catch a cold, right? They always tell you like, oh, stay hydrated and drink water, right?
Yep.
And that's true, by the way. Like that's great advice. Your immune system needs to be able to move stuff around, and water is going to facilitate that happening. It's also going to help you regulate your temperature. There's a million reasons to drink water. But if you did go way too far in that one direction and you just chugged it like crazy, you can actually deplete your water soluble vitamins because they get carried away out your pee, and you're peeing a million times a day. So you end up making yourself vitamin deficient, which is part of your, you know, immune system. Um, for the record, nobody ever actually pulls that off. Like nobody's drinking enough water because nobody drinks enough water. But it can happen, you know. I mean,
I'm guilty. I'm guilty.
Yeah, right. Yeah, I mean, I'm the same way. So that's why like blanket terms like that get a little dangerous in the nutrition realm. So monosaccharides, right? Glucose, that's mainly our energy supplier. Galactose, that's the simple sugar found in milk. Fructose is the sweetness in fruits. Sucrose is table sugar. Lactose, also found in milk. Maltose, also found in milk. Then you get your oligosaccharides. These are going to be like slightly complex, but still pretty simple. High fructose corn syrup is a really good example of this. Like I know like high fructose corn syrup has been demonized. And you know, that's partly very rational because it's like a high source of calories with zero nutritional value, you know? It's like, hey, here's a ton of, you know, calories with like no vitamins and minerals attached to it. So it definitely deserves like some of the ire, but at the end of the day, I mean, it is still more complex than like table sugar. But then you also have maltodextrins, right? Those are a lot of like sweet things that they will also add into certain, you know, complex carbs. But again, not very complex. Your really complex stuff is going to be your starches, and then especially your fiber. So actually, I'm gonna put a little bit talk about fiber here. So fiber is going to be actually the type of carbohydrates that your body cannot break down. So fiber is complex chains of carbohydrates that are so complex the body cannot break them down, so they pass through the digestive tract whole. not broken down. So fiber is really, really great. Like starches, right? Those are the ones that we're talking about in like grains and stuff like that. They're really great for giving us long lasting energy. But fiber, especially, is so complex. Your digestive system's trying to beat the crap out of it, and it really just can't. It really actually gets, um, it's so complex that your digestive system really can't get through those cell walls and break it down. And that's a really good thing because we want something like that to pass through our digestive tract. Again, you got to remember that it's like the outside environment, even though it's inside your body. And so that fiber goes through your digestive tract. And if there's anything that just didn't get absorbed, but also didn't get pushed through your digestive system, fiber is going to attach it and grab it and pull it out. So I'm going to use an analogy to give you an example of this. You know, cats are strictly carnivores. Cats actually produce ATP with the use of protein through gluconeogenesis. So cats do not eat carbohydrates. If you actually give your cat something like sugary, they can't even taste it. They can't taste glucose. They don't have taste receptors for glucose molecules. And that's because they're not really designed to eat it. But they will occasionally, you'll notice cats will go out onto your lawn and eat grass. And you're like, what are you doing? Why are you eating the grass? Right? And the reason they do that is because grass is almost 100% cellulose, which is a fiber. So their digestive system can't break it down. But cats also spend all day cleaning themselves, and so a lot of hair gets into their digestive tract, which also can't get broken down. So when they eat grass, it actually acts as fiber to pull that out of their digestive tract. Now, let's apply like a similar logic to our situation. You know, there are certain foods that we consume that don't get broken down all that well, or maybe like between all the folds of our villi and in our lumens in the digestive tract, you know, we find that some food is like left behind, right? Well, fiber is going to go through and grab that stuff and pull it out of our body. And that way it doesn't get to stay in there and cause us too much trouble. And that's a really important part of our diet. One of the reasons why this is, oh my God, guys. One of the reasons why fiber is associated with like a reduced risk for cardiovascular disease is because now that stuff doesn't actually sit in your gut and it pulls a lot of those fatty acid chains out of your digestive system that could cause you problems. So we're a big fan of fiber. We're a big fan of high fiber foods. Also, another benefit on the other side of things is that fiber is also so complex. Your digestive system spends a whole bunch of time trying to break it down and honestly failing. And the reason that's a good thing is because like that leads you to feeling fuller for much longer. So if you are on like a low calorie diet and you know you start to get hangry, eating high fiber foods can actually assist with that because it can leave you feeling fuller and more satisfied for a greater period of time. We're going to talk about some of those hacks actually in the next few days when we look at like dietary advice on like a large scale. So that's fiber, and that's why that stuff is so important. So carbohydrates, right? They're going to provide fuel for activities. They also are considered a protein-sparing nutrient. And when we say that, what we mean by protein-sparing is that the intake of these carbohydrates actually prevent your body from catabolizing your own tissues, right? Like if you don't get enough energy, your body's going to go, all right, well, we must not be getting enough energy. I have way too much glute muscle. Let's get rid of some of that, you know? So it'll actually, you know, break that muscle down and use it through gluconeogenesis to produce energy. So having enough carbohydrates in your diet actually prevents that from happening. It also acts as a primary source of energy for your nervous system. Your nervous system is basically on a glucose exclusive diet. Your nervous system needs to be able to produce energy at the drop of a hat, so it prefers to do it through using glucose molecules because that ATP production happens so quickly. Remember, glycolysis is something that occurs super rapidly. It may not make very much ATP, but it does happen very, very quickly. And so glucose is definitely the thing that we prefer to use for that. But it also does assist in the metabolizing of fats. You actually need to have carbohydrates in order to effectively metabolize fat. So remember that fats need to go through a process called beta oxidation before they can be converted into acetyl-CoA and then go through the Krebs cycle, right? So beta oxidation, actually, like a precursor to that, is burning glucose as a fuel source. So this is where you'll sometimes hear the phrase, fat burns in a flame of carbohydrates. So by previously performing glycolysis, it is going to make your beta oxidation available. Also, it is going to facilitate adequate fiber intake. Most healthy carbohydrates are associated with a high amount of fiber, and that fiber is what allows you, again, to kind of clean out your digestive tract. People have heard me say this before, like, it's not that I am anti-cleansing. I know that there's like juice cleanses out there. There's a million different types of cleanses. You drink cayenne pepper, lemon water, and it'll, clean you out. Here's how I don't necessarily say that cleanses are bad for you. In fact, a lot of times, like certain juice cleanses can be really good for you because of their high vitamin content. But the idea of eating no calories, I'm not a big fan of. But you will not hear me say cleanses are bad for you. You will hear me say that cleanses don't exist in the way people think they do. Which, if you want to interpret that as me saying that you shouldn't do them, you can. But the reason I say cleanses don't exist in the way people think they do, a lot of times they're like, yeah, it cleans out your blood. And it's like, that's not how our digestive tract works. Like, fiber acts as like almost like an exfoliant, like those stones and rocks that people use on their skin. And you scrape off all your dead skin and it makes your pores look good, I guess. We're in the skin, which is not the area of anatomy that I spend any time on. Well, fiber kind of does that inside your digestive tract. Its job is to scrub everything inside clean. And so, like, if you want to go on a cleanse, go get a plate full of beans. They are super, super high in fiber. Go eat some brown rice. That's a great source of fiber. Go get some double fiber bread. Go get some whole wheat, whole grain bread. All that stuff are really good sources of fiber, and that's going to pull that out. Eat a bowl of oatmeal, So when it comes to carbohydrate consumption, we do have something that is referred to as the acceptable macronutrient distribution range, or the AMDR. And this is a range determined by the USDA, right, the Department of Agriculture. And it states that, and basically what an AMDR is the range of a particular energy source that is associated with reduced risk of disease while also providing intakes of essential nutrients. And so it's basically like, well, how much of your diet should be this versus that, right? And so the acceptable macronutrient range for carbohydrates is going to be 45 to 65% of your daily total caloric intake. And that is a number you're going to want to kind of have memorized. They like to ask that in your regular NASM test, and they like to ask that in your nutrition test as well. That's definitely just like a number that comes up very often. So if you're consuming a 2,000 calorie diet, then you want to be getting 900 to, no, that's not true, 1,800 to 30, oh my God, math. No, I had it right. 900 to 1,300 calories of that 2,000 calories. You want 900 to 1,300 of it to be from carbohydrate sources. And because we know there are 4 calories per every gram of carbohydrates, you just take 900 and divide it by 4, which means you want to get about 225 grams of carbs per day at minimum on a 2,000 calorie diet. Does that make sense? Probably not, because I screwed it up. But when we look at the math in a couple of days, we'll go over those numbers again. So what are good sources of carbohydrates? Like the sources you should primarily be focused on? Well, generally we're going to focus on whole wheat, whole grain sources, oatmeals and quinoas, things like that. Spelt berries, couscous, those are all really good examples of grains. Other really good sources or high sources of carbohydrates are going to be vegetables in the form of like fresh vegetables are great, frozen vegetables are great, even some canned ones are really, really good. Dried fruits and vegetables actually hold a significant amount of their nutrients. I know that it doesn't seem like you look at like a dehydrated banana chip and you're like, there's no way that has the same amount of nutrients it used to. It's actually fairly comparable because all that stuff gets locked inside. Frozen, same concept. There's a lot of nutrition that's prevented from being lost whenever you freeze a vegetable. You got to remember that like most of the like nutrition is like the minute you pluck something out of the ground, that plant's no longer like growing, and so it's kind of dying and oxidizing nutrients off of it the second you pick it from the ground. So if you were to freeze something immediately after you pick it, a lot of that nutrient content doesn't oxidize anymore, it gets locked in. And so certain vegetables actually will have a higher nutrient content when they are frozen versus like fresh ones, which are actually oxidizing constantly. One of the best ways to kind of picture that is to look at your vegetable, and if it has like a protective shell around the outside of it, then that's the type that probably survives pretty well on a shelf. But if you look at something like broccoli, for instance, which is kind of like all the florets are kind of exposed, right? All of those are kind of oxidizing very easily. So frozen broccoli might actually be a more nutritious option than fresh, which is kind of surprising when you think about it. And even canned versions sometimes. So other sources. Now, this is not, I said excellent sources here. I should just say like sources, because these are just where they come from. Other sources of carbohydrates you're going to find are milk and milk products, right? Yogurt's going to have natural carbohydrates in it. Regular milk has plenty because of all those galactose, maltose, and lactose sugars that we are going to find. You're also going to find like certain carbohydrates that are actually very heavy in protein. Legumes like beans are a really good example of that. Nuts are a really good example of that. Soy products are a really good example of that. That's why like generally soy, like what's it called? Tofu is a really good example of like something that is very proteiny, but also very carbohydrate heavy. The Impossible Burger, right? You're gonna find some carbohydrates in that, which, you know, that's the only kind of key difference between the Impossible Burger and a regular burger. You know, most of it is made from like soy products and things like that, I think. So it looks very, very similar to meat, but you will find like a slightly higher carbohydrate density in there because of the ingredients that are found inside. Other sources are things like sweets and sodas and stuff like that. Obviously, very, very simple sugars found in those things. That's what makes them taste so freaking sweet. And that is what, you know, also makes them kind of unhealthy because they hit your blood sugar super, super quickly. So when it comes down to like choosing your carbohydrate sources, you are primarily going to want to focus on nutrient dense options, right? So nutrient dense options are carbohydrates that have lots of vitamins and minerals in them, right? They have lots of other nutritious aspects to them. You look at a cupcake, you know, there's an old, God, I didn't even think about this before I started saying it. There's an old Bill Cosby joke, freaking guy. But it was a pretty great joke where he was talking about how like his kids wanted chocolate cake for breakfast, and he looked inside the ingredients and saw eggs and flour, which is a carbohydrate, and you know, all this stuff. And it's like, yeah, but you didn't see all the sugar. You know, there's not a lot of vitamins left in that chocolate cake. It's not exactly a good source of food. This is one of the reasons why like I'm always surprised that we like are so obsessed with like pancakes. It's like we have dessert for breakfast sometimes in this country, and it's, I think, one of the biggest problems that we have. We have a weird definition of breakfast in the US. Now, luckily, we've, you know, because of our love for pancakes, we've started making healthier and healthier versions of them where there's more like nutritious examples of like whole wheat pancakes that are also high in protein. That's great. Like I'm on board, but don't ruin it with like a whole bunch of shit, you know, corn syrup. And so like, that's what we want to talk about when we talk about like carbohydrates. We want to focus primarily on nutrient dense carbohydrates, right? Like if we go back and look at like beans as a carbohydrate source, those are going to be full of iron and other minerals and vitamins, right? Or if we look at like broccoli as a carbohydrate source, that's going to be packed full of vitamin C and fiber and all kinds of other stuff. That's a nutritious version versus, you know, Coca-Cola, which is going to be basically pure high fructose corn syrup. So talking about how those things, I did mention briefly like how that's going to affect your bloodstream. Well, part of that is going to be talking about what we call the glycemic index, right? So the glycemic index is basically a chart that classifies how carbohydrates affect your bloodstream. So if something is really high on the glycemic index, that is something that your digestive system is able to break down and get into your bloodstream very, very quickly. That's great if you are mid-sporting event, but that's not so awesome if you're sitting on the couch. Because what ends up happening is your blood sugar spikes, your body releases a bunch of insulin, that insulin pulls that sugar out of your blood and stores it. Now, if your glycogen stores are empty, cool, you're going to store that sugar as glycogen. But if your glycogen stores are full, it's going to have to store that as fat instead, which is not something that we really want to experience, right? So here's an example of the glycemic index here. I'll kind of pull this up. You can see like things that are much higher on the glycemic index versus things which are much lower. And so we're seeing like our glycemic loads here, right? So if we look at this one, Coca-Cola is going to be a 16 on this list. But even higher than that is actually honey, right? Honey is actually going to hit you even a little bit harder. And so, we're seeing like an apple, which is pretty freaking sweet, but it's only a 6 on the list because an apple has like a lot of fiber and other things that slow that process of absorbing those nutrients down. But if we look at like a raspberry smoothie, which is like another fruit, but it's been broken up in a blender and now it's just like all the fiber has been destroyed, it's much higher on the glycemic load because it's going to be absorbed into your bloodstream way, 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 way faster. So, this isn't necessarily a list of good foods and bad foods. Like, don't think that, right? Like orange juice is a 13. Are oranges on here? Just regular old oranges? Come on. No, they put apples on here. I'm comparing apples and oranges. So orange juice is a 13, but an apple is a 6, right? And that's because the apple still has all of its fiber intact. So certain things will affect your blood sugar much more than others. So if my client was like really ill in the gym because maybe we worked out really hard and their blood sugar fell through the floor, well, then I'm probably going to get that person an orange juice, But if my client's doing pretty well and I'm trying to give them enough energy to like continue moving on, but I don't want to completely spike their blood sugar levels, maybe I'll give them something like apple slices. Your body does prefer to use carbohydrates as a fuel source for low to moderate exercise levels are aerobically metabolized, right? So your body primarily likes to use carbohydrate in like higher, like moderate to high intensity, right? But obviously it's still happening in the background of that low to moderate exercise level. So you are still using carbohydrates, you're just using them aerobically instead of anaerobically, right? So carbohydrates will support your aerobic metabolism. They're the precursor, right? They're the initial glucose molecule. Carbohydrates get used anaerobically for the intense stuff, but they also do get used in the background aerobically for the unintense stuff. And that's where we have to kind of talk about like what's called your crossover point. The crossover point is the point at which fats become the main source of energy, right? So if your intensity is super high, like let's say you just started exercising, right? And so you're working really, really hard. You're trying to run as fast as you can. And what's going to happen is, in the beginning, you're working really, really fast and you're sprinting really, really hard, right? Let's look at like maybe a mile race in the way that Steve Prefontaine would run it, right? He was notorious for sprinting really hard out the gate. And, he would kind of slow down throughout the rest of the race where everybody else would kind of pace themselves. And so like he would go out really, really hard. And then as the duration increased, his intensity would lower down. And what's happening is when his intensity is really high, carbohydrates are supplying most of the energy for the fuel. So as his intensity lowers because his duration's increasing, fats are supplying more and more and more of the energy. Now, there's a point at which carbohydrates are falling below the level and fats are about to raise, like where you are at 50% carbs, 50% fat for as a fuel source. That's the crossover point. So this moment just before this happens, I'm sorry, we're just after this happens, where you are primarily burning fat as a fuel source, is referred to as the fat burning zone. And so while you're like running, for instance, let's say you're at like 65 to 75% of your max intensity, that's an intensity that you should be able to keep up for a pretty extended duration, right? Well, that is going to be your fat burning zone because that's something that you can do for a long time. That is a low intensity exercise. But if you raise your intensity, you start recruiting more and more muscle fibers, you start to drop back into that anaerobic metabolism, right? So that as you do that, you're using more anaerobically, you're using more and more and more carbohydrates. So the fat burning zone is just below where you are still burning mostly fat for fuel instead of carbohydrates for fuel. So carbohydrates get broken down into glucose, which go through glycolysis to produce pyruvate, which can then become acetyl-CoA, which can go through the Krebs cycle, which can then go through the electron transport chain. Now, how do we store carbohydrates in our body? Well, we're going to do it in one of two ways. We got two stored forms of energy in the human body. Technically, we've got three. Like if you consider, well, I've got muscle and I can always break that down. Yeah, you can. So technically that does count, but it's not really, something we want to do. So our two stored forms of energy in the body are going to be in the forms of carbs and fat. Fat, you have a huge amount of storage of. Carbohydrates, it's fairly limited. And so glycogen is how we store fat inside our body, right? We can store about 400 to 600 grams of carbohydrates in your liver and in your muscles, depending on how much muscle you have or how large your liver is, like depending on your body size. So it's about 16 to 2,400 calories worth of energy, which if you think about like running a marathon, that's going to take around that much energy, which is why you become glycogen depleted. So that's one way that we store it. But we also have our fat cells, right? We have adipocytes, which are the fat cells inside of our body. So if you consume an excess of carbohydrates and your body, creates insulin to pull those carbohydrates out of your blood in order to like store them, right? It's like your body's like, look, I don't need any more glucose. I'm producing enough energy as it is right now. We got plenty of sugar running through the blood. Let's pull some of this out and store it for later, right? If your glycogen stores are already full because you haven't done any activity, your body will convert that glucose into a fatty acid. And it'll turn it into a triglyceride and store it inside of your fat cells. Because remember, carbohydrates and fats are both compounds made of carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen. So that's kind of how that works. And, we're estimated to have we got 16 to 2,400 calories worth of carbs. We got 90,000 calories per cell. You got tons and tons and tons of energy stored in your fat tissues. So carbohydrates, they're really good at performing anaerobic glycolysis. That is our short-term energy system without the need for oxygen, right? But they can also be metabolized in the presence of oxygen with that oxidative metabolism. They do sort of act as that precursor. So how do you actually consume carbohydrates? Well, about 0 to 4 exercise, try to get some carbo-complex foods, right? The more complex food you can get, the more likely your body is to be able to continue breaking that down while you're performing activity, which will, give you you're running and your body's like, well, I'm still digesting some of those carbs. A little bit of glucose enters the bloodstream. A little bit of glucose enters the bloodstream. A little bit of glucose, right? Like that continues to happen thanks to complex carbs. Complex carbs are complex, so they take a long time to break down. Try to get a carbohydrate rich and good protein source. You can get something honestly, if you're gonna go do like a marathon or something, one of the best foods you can eat beforehand is like a bean burrito. It's full of protein, it's full of carbs, and it's full of fiber, so that'll actually help slow the absorption down, so you'll continue getting energy throughout the race. 2 hours prior to exercise, try to get a light meal. You might actually get like a carbohydrate-rich beverage. This is where getting like a simpler carbohydrate right before activity can be super helpful, because that stuff might enter your bloodstream really quickly. So Gatorade is actually a really good example of that, because that is packed full of sugar. Make no mistake about it. I'm not saying it's healthy. I'm saying it is effective for sports. And so that can get straight into your bloodstream to help you have like intense activity in the very beginning of whatever sporting event you're doing. Then, like, as you start to deplete through that, you start to take over with those complex carbs that you ate earlier. So factors that need to be considered in after exercise. Also, you need to make sure that you're getting plenty of carbohydrates post exercise. It's not so much about the work that you just did. Like, a lot of times we think of like eating after a workout, to recover our body and like, facilitate muscle growth. But we got to remember that you do want, so a lot of times people will put a lot of emphasis on protein, but we got to remember that like you have to work out again tomorrow. And so you actually want to restore your glycogen levels back to the levels that they were at before you started exercising. You broke down glycogen like crazy while you were exercising. So make sure you get some carbohydrates post-exercise in order to replace that glycogen. It's not about the workout you just did, it's about your workout tomorrow. So in summary, the kind of broad stroke important points here: carbohydrates are essential for performance. They should be around 6 to 10 grams per kilogram of body weight. If your client is like a major athlete, they can sometimes be up to 55 to 70% of your total calories. Generally, though, the number we want you guys to know is 45 to 65%. That's the regular AMDR. This is for actually like a specific athlete. They're commonly classified into simple versions or complex versions. Glucose is going to be the most simple. That's what our body is trying to get when it actually breaks down carbohydrates. And they are the sole source of energy for intense activity. Then
I got a thing. I got a question.
Yeah, what's up?
So, like, how you're talking about, you want to restore your carbohydrates right after your workout.
Totally.
Like, most everybody they take like a protein shake right after.
Yep.
What's another good thing to have? Like, if you're gonna have your protein shake and then you have, like, what's a good carb thing we can take or recommend taking?
Honestly, like Gatorades and things like that are kind of the classic example. Like juices, because juices are just very high in sugar, and so your body's like, in this super post-absorptive state, and it's like, oh, great, and it just takes everything in. Gatorade doesn't have a lot of other, it has like sodium and like potassium in it, which is really nice for your nervous system. But so that can prevent like things like cramping. But again, it's really high in like sugars, and that's, as far as nutrients go, that's it, like sodium, potassium, Whereas like a smoothie or something like that, like juices, fruit juices, stuff like that, that's like orange juice even, that is still very sugar heavy, but at least it has like high levels of vitamin C, A, D, E, and K, like all these great vitamins and minerals in it. So honestly, the best thing you can do is get like a protein shake that actually has some carbohydrates in it. And like, that's a really, really good version there. A lot of times people like focus primarily on like isolates after a workout, and those are really great. But the problem is like they are missing some of those other nutrients that we talk about, right?
Okay, I got you. Because I purchased before like low carb proteins, but
Totally.
it's not necessarily a good idea if I need to restore my my carbohydrates right at the end of the workout.
Exactly. Yeah.
Gotcha.
But it's not necessarily the end of the world if you're doing that. Like, I like protein isolates because isolates do break things down really, like they break them down very simply, so then your body can absorb that protein very quickly and it can start amino acid production very fast. But I like to use isolates in like a smoothie whenever I can, or I'll mix it with like a fruit juice, or even things like, milk can sometimes be nutritious. If like calcium is something that you need, that's great. You're not getting very many vitamins or minerals out of milk, but you are getting a lot of sugar, so you're getting your carbohydrates back. And one thing that you're definitely getting a lot of is like calcium, and that can be
Mm.
very helpful. Plus, it's even more protein.
Yeah. Okay.
The one thing you want to, this is something that we don't talk too much about. The one thing you kind of want to avoid nutrition wise after a workout is actually fat content. Not that fat's like unhealthy for you, like fat is, it should be a huge part of your diet. We're about to talk about it, but like, fat is one of the things that your body takes time to absorb first. So if your goal is to get protein synthesis started as quickly as possible, consuming fat can actually slow that process down. So like I would say keep fat away from your first post-workout meal,
Okay.
and just like focus primarily on like carbs and protein.
Okay.
So protein first, carbs second, both very important. Fat way down here.
Okay. Yeah.
All right. Speaking of fats, let's look at it. So fat, super vital nutrient, right? Acts as a primary energy source, especially when we are at rest. Our body prefers to use fat as a fuel source when we're just sitting around resting. It supplies us with fatty acids, which are totally necessary for our body to be able to make like cell walls. So we need fat in general, but we also need fatty acids because our body can't synthesize those itself. And your membranes are made up of a large amount of fat and some fatty acids. It also helps you meet your energy needs, which is really nice. Like if you have trouble getting enough calories in, fats are a great way. It'll just amp things up instantly. Go eat a handful of almonds, boom, you just got a ton of calories in your diet. And they also are really great like energy reserve because they can be stored on our body to provide us with long-term energy sources later. You know, like this is part of the way that we insulate our body and all of our organs. That's how we actually protect them. And they also carry certain substances like your fat soluble vitamins into your bloodstream, which is hugely important. Also, talking similarly to how we talked about fiber earlier, they can also leave you feeling fuller longer because they increase what we call satiety. And we'll be talking more about satiety when we get into like nutrition coaching. So when we're talking about fats, we're talking about three primary categories: triglycerides, phospholipids, and sterols. And so a triglyceride is a glycerol molecule and 3 fatty acids. A phospholipid is 2 fatty acids. Sterols are usually carbon rings attached to steroid hormones, which are like, sterols are how plants actually store fat inside their body. So in the same way that like we have fat stored up so that like we have energy to give us supply on the go, plants do the same thing. They do them in much lower levels in certain plants, but they do them in super high levels, like in an avocado, you know? You're gonna find sterols in avocados like crazy. And that's a good thing. That's you know, it's a really good source of fat for us. So generally when we're talking about like, those are all of our main classifications of like the lipids that we're talking about. Now, generally when we're talking about fat consumption, we are talking about whether or not that fatty acid is saturated with hydrogen or whether or not it is not saturated with hydrogen. So your saturated fat is fat molecules that contain filled up hydrogen binding sites. So what that means is that they are generally longer and straighter, and they're able to stack themselves fairly efficiently. That's why saturated fats are solid at room temperature, is because you can actually see here, they stack really efficiently. So saturated fatty acid. If we look at this here, oh, this is great. I got both of them. So here's a saturated fat, right? This can be stacked really efficiently. I want to see like a bunch of, actually, I'm going to pull up this picture. Show me a bunch of them together. Stacked. Come on, images. Yeah, that kind of works. All right, so you can see like you can stack, that's not really it. That looks similar to a picture that I want, but that's not officially what it actually looks like. Here we go. So you can see a saturated fat can kind of stack itself super efficiently. This is why it's like, again, if it's at room temperature, it tends to be solid. Like butter has a lot of saturated fat in it, but to be fair to butter, it has some unsaturated fat in it as well. And that's why butter is slick, you know? But if you look at like a steak, you know, you can see the fat around the outside and it's like, you can poke it and it's going to stay in its form, right? That's a solid. Now, you can see here, these little kinks here that you're finding in these are unsaturated fats, right? So, ooh, no. Unsaturated fats are where there's actually, you can see like how there's hydrogen binding at all of these sites here, but see how there's a little gap right here? That's unsaturated. That means that there is space for hydrogen to attach itself. And then here, this is monounsaturated. There's one space here. This, there's two spaces, or maybe there's even more spaces than that. That's what a polyunsaturated fat is. So saturated fat has filled hydrogen binding sites, okay? And unsaturated fats have space for one or more binding sites. And that's what makes them liquid at room temperature. They're not stacking quite as efficiently. Now, the two categories of unsaturated fats that you're going to find are mono, so one unsaturated binding site, or polyunsaturated fat, which is many empty binding sites, right? So these are both really good sources of fatty acids that are essential for us, right? So essential fatty acids are fatty acids that have to be obtained by your diet. Your body cannot make these fatty acids without it, and your cell walls need these fatty acids. So you are going to get some of them from saturated fat, but very, very, very low levels. Your unsaturated fats, your monounsaturated, and particularly your polyunsaturated fats, those are the ones where you are going to get a really great source of lots of fatty acids. So we typically classify those as the good fats, right? We think of like the unsaturated, the oils, like the healthy oils. We think of those as like our good fats, right? And that's not a bad way to think about it. However, one of the things that is associated with like inflammation is when you actually get way too many omega-3s and not enough omega-6s. If your ratio of those two actually gets out of whack, that can sometimes lead to inflammation. So eating a diet high in olive oil is good for you as long as you are also getting plenty of polyunsaturated fats. Olive oils and things like that are highly associated with those omega-6s. Things like fish oils, flaxseed oils, things like that, those are commonly associated with polyunsaturated fats. Those are where you're going to get your omega-3s. And those are really, really important fatty acids. And that's why so many people take, fish oil supplements and krill supplements and stuff like that, because they are just an excellent source of those omega-3 fatty acids. Now, there's one thing that I haven't talked about yet. One final category of fat, which is trans fats. So these are hydrogenated fats. These are fatty acids that have had hydrogen atoms added to them. So if you take this empty space and you shove a hydrogen molecule on there, you have hydrogenated it. You saturated this empty molecule with hydrogen. So a trans fat is something that does not exist in nature. It is actually where you fill that bond, right? This is empty, and then you fill it. And what that ends up doing is that takes this kind of kinked shape here, and it straightens it out. It actually like straightens the whole thing. And so now you've taken those good, healthy oils, which couldn't stack themselves very efficiently. They couldn't really clog up our arteries. If they get into our body, they're not really going to park themselves on our blood vessel. But then because we transmodified them, we straighten them out, and now they can stack themselves crazy efficiently, and they can clog the crap out of your body. You guys have heard me say this before. I know I say it all the time. I don't like to tell people what not to eat when it comes to diet plans. I think diets tend to focus on what not to eat instead of what to eat. And then that leads to like a really negative feeling when it comes to like dieting, right? However, the one thing that you do really kind of want to try to stay away from are hydrogenated oils. You do really want to stay away from trans fats. They actually have been shown to destroy good fats because of how undense they are. They end up stealing fat molecules from your good, healthy fatty acids. And they are associated with what we call very low density lipoprotein. So if we think of like low density cholesterol as the bad cholesterol, well, this stuff is very low dense, and it can actually kill your good cholesterol. So it's like, good God, hydrogenated fats are bad. And you actually get them from mono and polyunsaturated fats. if you superheat an oil such as olive oil or canola oil or peanut oil, those are sort of the most common ones that people like to use. If you superheat those, they start stripping hydrogen atoms out of the air, and that's what hydrogenated means. Now, why would we ever do that? Well, number one, fried foods taste real good. When you deep fry something, you are hydrogenating that food. And so all that oil that you are cooking it in, when you're deep frying something, is sucking those hydrogen atoms out of the air. And it makes it taste real freaking tasty. I mean, we love French fries, right? But one of the other reasons that they'll add it to certain like baked goods and stuff is because it gives it a super long shelf life. Bacteria and things like that really honestly, bacteria are smarter than we are. They know not to eat trans fats. And so when you put hydrogenated oils into something, honestly, mold and bacteria and stuff like that really doesn't grow on it as effectively, which is why if you ever dropped a McDonald's French fry between the seats of your car and you find it like 6 years later and it looks exactly the same as the day you bought it, that's because there's a lot of trans fat in those French fries. They were deep fried, and so bacteria is like, I ain't touching that thing. So the one thing that I'll tell you to stay away from hydrogenated fats. They are very bad. Now, again, we see the word essential here, right? Remember when we were talking about like the idea essential, it means that it is essential that you consume it in your diet. This is the stuff that your body can't make, so you've got to get it from foods. So essential fatty acids are fatty acids that need to obtain from the diet. The examples here are linoleic acid and linolenic acid, which are, I can't believe I actually said that effectively. I normally goof that up. So these are your omega-3 and your omega-6 fatty acids that I mentioned previously. Now, you do have other fatty acids, which are your non-essential fatty acids. Those are ones that your body can make, right? Your body can kind of break some other stuff apart and make those. Other things that you need to consume, you need to get phospholipids in your diet. You're going to get those when you consume fat. But phospholipids allow you to emulsify fat, like for instance, like in bile. They also are really responsible for like transporting lipids and other materials throughout your body. And phospholipids are what make up your cell walls. So those fatty acids are highly associated with the synthesis of your phospholipids. Another one that you've got are sterols, like I said, found in both plants and animals. And those are basically fatty acids with a carbon ring attached to them. Now, one of the most important ones that we got to talk about is cholesterol. A lot of times we think of cholesterol and we instantly go to it's like, oh, cholesterol is bad for you. And it certainly can be, like, make no mistake. Too much of the bad stuff is absolutely bad for you. But cholesterol comes in a couple different forms, and it does do different things. It gives structure to your cell membrane. It assists in the generation of vitamin D, which keeps your bones strong. Vitamin D assists in calcium absorption, so you need to have plenty of vitamin D in order to be able to synthesize calcium effectively. And cholesterol is really important for producing your steroid hormones, such as testosterone, estrogen, progesterone, things like that. So in general, when it comes to fat intake, you want it to be, and actually I should have put this up there, you want it to be about 20 to 35% of your total intake. I got to modify our notes here. I forgot to put this earlier. AMDR should be 20 to 35% total caloric intake, with 7 to 10% of total intake from saturated fat. Make no mistake, saturated fat actually does have a lot of positive things in it, right? You can find cholesterols, which again are important in saturated fat. But the problem is we live in a world where we are consuming animal protein constantly, and we get a lot of it in the developing world. You know, part of the reason why America has like so many heart disease problems is because we are a wealthy nation that is able to consume a lot of things that have lots of saturated fats in them. And so that has been linked to blah, 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 cardiovascular disease. Whew! I was like, what's the name of the heart? Heart disease. So You want only about 7 to 10% of your total calories to really come from saturated fats, and the remaining part of your fat should be coming from unsaturated fat sources. And then in terms of omega-3s and omega-6s, you want to get 17 grams a day of the omega-6s and about 1.6 grams a day of the omega-3s. 12 grams a day for women and 1 gram per day for women in the omega-3s. And this is another reason why actually women tend to have actually less heart disease than men. You guys actually synthesize omega-3 fatty acids much more effectively than men do. That and other reasons. We've also associated like meat with being manly. That's a whole different conversation. When we're talking about cholesterols, right? Like I said, you've got the good stuff and the bad stuff, right? Your LDL, this is going to be the bad stuff, right? Your low density lipoproteins. Now, for the record, LDL is important inside of your body. It's not that it's always bad for you. It actually carries cholesterol to your cells, right? And we need cholesterol to be able to get to our cells. But again, it is linked to, excessive levels of it are linked to heart disease, especially when those are very low density lipoproteins. So those are the ones that are found in trans fats. You've also got your HDL cholesterol, which is the high density stuff. And this is typically thought of as the good cholesterol. And basically it's really dense, full of cholesterol molecules rather than being full of like triglycerides, like in LDL cholesterol. So HDL cholesterol actually, rather than carrying cholesterol like to your cells, HDL cholesterol is kind of roaming around through your bloodstream, gathering excess cholesterol molecules that might be parking themselves on your blood vessels. And this is why this is the stuff that cleans out your blood and cleans out reduces your risk for heart disease, which is why if you've ever heard somebody who's coming back from a heart attack, their doctor will tell them two things: more fiber, more good cholesterol, right? More omega-3s and more omega-6s and more fiber. So we are going to find a little bit of fat.
We would get our good cholesterol from like fish and stuff like that.
Absolutely, yeah. Fish is a great source, particularly fatty fishes. I cannot stand them, but anchovies are one of the healthiest freaking foods you can eat.
Really? Oh, they're so nasty.
I can't, man. My friend Rebecca, she's a dietitian. She loves them. Her and her husband both are just anchovy obsessed. I'm like, I don't know how you do it.
Yeah, that's gross. Yep.
But they are very good for you. Make no mistake.
Okay.
I try to get mine from salmon.
Yeah, me too. Salmon.
Yeah. The Rock, he loves cod. I think that's his big one. Mackerel's another really good one. I'm trying to like think of all the fish that I know are super healthy. Even tuna is really good in terms of omegas, but you got to be careful because tuna is like a predator fish. Generally, when you're trying to pick fish, you kind of want to pick the fish that get eaten by other fish rather than the fish that eat other fish. Like you want to pick prey, not predators, because if it's like a fish that's eating other fish and there's just like a lot of mercury in the water, then you're getting more and more like mercury levels, and that's just not one of the minerals we want to have too much of in our body. That is not an essential mineral. That is something you want to try to avoid. But that's also a talk for another day. We'll probably discuss that tomorrow, actually. So whole grains, they're going to have unsaturated fats in them. That's a great source, actually. Biscuits and croissants generally have lots of trans fats in them and saturated fats. They are baked goods. They will superheat, while baking. Now, if you were to make like a biscuit and you had like oil in it, like you used, unsaturated fat oil in it, that actually could be fine as long as you cook it low and slow over like a temperature that doesn't modify that fat. But if there's like a smoking point, if you look at the different smoking points of oils, you're going to see like different degrees that sort of create that modification, right? Like almond oil, which is not one I've ever cooked at, has a smoking point of 430 degrees. That's pretty low. That means that this could be modified really, really quickly. Whereas avocado oil has like a 520 degree. I don't cook anything in my house at 500 degrees. I don't really use 520 degrees as a setting on my oven, you know? So avocado oil is a very safe oil to use. But if you look at like canola oil, right, that's got a smoking point of like, I mean, all the way down to 225, which means it's great for deep frying because you can heat up that oil, you know, without, you know, worrying about burning your house down. So this is generally the type of oil that we find. This is why canola oil is considered a bad oil. But to be fair to canola oil, it's not bad as long as you don't overheat it. But we constantly overheat it. So whole grains, biscuits, fruits and vegetables. Yeah, a lot of times vegetables don't really have much unless you're talking about like nuts. But oils are a primary source. Dairy, super high of fat, and all of it is freaking saturated. I shouldn't say that. But a lot of it is saturated. Protein, like red meat in particular, is going to be really full of like, red meat's going to be full of saturated fat. Poultry, moderate levels of fat, but most of it's saturated. And then fish, really good examples of unsaturated omega-3 fatty acids. That's definitely going to be found in things like fish. Cholesterol, again, it can be found in any type of, you know, plants or animals, but typically you're going to find lots of cholesterol, particularly the low density stuff found in meats, eggs, and lots of like egg products that are baked into like baked goods. So when we're talking about cholesterol, we are talking about your total cholesterol levels and your triglycerides. So if your doctor just gives you like, it's like, hey, your cholesterol is high and that's all they say, they mean that like you either have really high HDL and LDL and triglycerides. You could have any of those totaling up to one big number. That is your total cholesterol. But it's made up of your high density lipoproteins, the good cholesterol, and the low density lipoproteins, the bad cholesterol. Again, your body wouldn't make either of them if they weren't good for you. It's just that we have gone, you know, in the way that we live our lifestyles, we eat way too much of the what we call bad stuff. But bad cholesterol actually has good properties. It's just we abuse them. Except that's how it is with most foods, except trans fats. Trans fats are always bad. I like to get they're the devil's fat. So we like fat. It's great. It can be used as a fuel source for our muscles. It can be used as a fuel source for our nervous system, but all at low intensity. So fats will get broken down into fatty acids, which will then go through the process of beta oxidation to turn them into acetyl-CoA, and then they'll go through the citric acid cycle. Once you get the citric acid cycle happening, you can do the electron transport chain. So they can be used. So how much fat should you consume? Well, generally when you have like a low fat meal about 4 hours prior to a training session, the nice thing is it'll give you a sustainable amount of energy, but you don't need like tons of it. And then after exercise, try to keep your fat levels to a minimum, so you can put an emphasis on like protein and carbohydrate absorption. If you have too much fat, your glycogen resynthesis can slow down, and that's not something we want to have happen. So vital nutrient, they give us molecular structure. High fat diets have been shown to, have not been shown, I'm sorry, to improve your endurance performance, because your body primarily likes to use carbohydrates. But fat intake, you know, is obviously very, very important and definitely something you do want to include in your diet. However, try to keep it away from your diet post-exercise, just because it's going to slow those other processes down. So that leads us to proteins, which is everybody's favorite thing to talk about. We love proteins. They're really, really good. We do want to, but honestly, they're actually fairly simple to understand. I mean, they're arguably one of the most important macronutrients, but they're relatively straightforward. So protein is obviously an essential nutrient for the proper functioning of athletes and really anybody. Your body is made up of a series of proteins. So you need to be able to like resynthesize those proteins. I mean, let's say I don't decide to work out today and I walk outside, you know, even the sun is going to damage and oxidize some of my cells. So I need to have protein intake to kind of be able to repair that and metabolize that for energy. So what is actually a protein, right? Well, proteins are going to be these big complex chains of amino acids, right? Amino acids are just like carbohydrates and just like fats. They are carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen, but they have a side chain of nitrogen, which gives them this interesting skeleton and gives them an interesting shape. So the shape of your protein is going to determine like what its function is inside the body. So take a look here. This is carbolic acid, oh my God, it's impossible to say, carboxylic acid. And so you can see here, hydrogen, hydrogen, carbon, carbon, oxygen, oxygen, hydrogen. But then you see this little R group right here. That R group is what makes this sort of generic amino acid unique. So if you look at these two here, they are totally different, but they have the same ingredients. It's the shape of those ingredients that make the unique amino acid. And what's interesting is all the amino acids come together in a unique order, and that unique order makes a unique protein. So the shape of your protein is going to determine its function, right? Its form determines its function. So your bones are specific types of proteins, your ligaments are a different type of protein, tendons are different from that, hair, muscles, enzymes, organs, all those things are different proteins in different shapes. Even in the form of like your pumps and your channels and your receptors on your cells, right? Remember we talked about like receptors the other day and how like those are what trigger like a cell doing something. You need to have like that receptor in order to be able to do that. Well, that receptor is a protein. So when your body is like repairing your cells, it uses fat to make the membrane, but it might straddle that membrane with a protein to allow, things to get inside and outside of the cell. And then your body also produces all kinds of different enzymes like lingual lipase and salivary amylase and pancreatic amylase. All of that stuff, those are all enzymes that kick off biochemical reactions. So you need to have those enzymes to be able to serve as the catalyst for a lot of your metabolism. So protein enables your immune system to create antibodies. It helps maintain your fluid levels and your pH level. And it can serve as an energy source, although we try to keep it from doing that as often as possible. So here's kind of an example of like all the things proteins do, right? They make hormones, they make enzymes, they make muscles, they transport things, all kinds of freaking stuff, right? And they can be used for energy, but we try to avoid it. And there's my favorite drawing. I love to draw proteins. They're big squigglies. So when we're talking about amino acids, right, we have what we call, and this is just our labeling for these things, right? We have what we call essential amino acids and non-essential amino acids, right? So essential amino acids are essential that you consume them, right? It's really important that you obtain them from your diet. So you've got 20 amino acids total, but of those amino acids, this histidine, isoleucine, leucine, lysine, methionine, phenylalanine, threonine, tryptophan, and valine, those 8 amino acids are the ones that are considered essential. You have to get them from your diet. Your body cannot make these. But your non-essential amino acids are the ones your body can make, right? That's the remaining 12 amino acids. And so non-essential can be produced. If I have isoleucine, I can break that apart to make things like aspartic and glutamic acid. I probably have that wrong, actually. It's probably another one. But basically, if you have one of your essentials, you can make your non-essentials. Now, you do also have what are called conditionally essential amino acids. And those are like, they become essential if you are depleted for like super long periods of time. But you can just throw them into the non-essential category. Now, you do also have branched chain amino acids. These are the ones that these are the BCAAs that you see in supplement stores all the freaking time. And branched chain amino acids are essential amino acids, so they actually fall into that essential category, which means I actually kind of have this in the wrong place. Let's put that over here. So these are amino acids that actually can be metabolized for energy within your muscle. And what's really cool about that is the fact that like if your body does metabolize BCAAs directly for energy, you're not depleting any of your actual proteins. They kind of act as like a shield or a buffer for that. So we really do like BCAAs. However, there is not a lot of evidence to suggest that taking BCAA supplements do anything for you, as long as you have a high enough protein diet. Now, if you are struggling to get enough protein in your diet, taking a BCAA supplement can be great for filling in those gaps. But that's, again, a classic example of like what a supplement is. it fills in the gaps of your bad diet. It's not meant to replace anything, right? It is there to supplement a healthy diet. So we'll talk more about that later, actually, and when we get into supplements real deep. Now, you do also have what we call a complete protein, or you have what we call an incomplete protein. A complete protein has all of those essential amino acids. We commonly associate complete proteins with animal sources, but you can find them in certain plant products, such as like soy and like certain grains like quinoa, for instance. Those actually could have all of the amino acids in them. Typically, plant sources we don't think of as having all of the amino acids that we need, but there are examples out there. Now, you're also going to see the term high quality protein, and that's basically a protein that has all of the essential amino acids, but it also has like other, really good properties. Like it can be digested really quickly. It can supply you with vitamins or minerals. So like when we think of like lean proteins, lean cuts of meat, grass-fed things like that, those are really good examples of high quality protein versus like, just a regular old meat that you get at like McDonald's, which, yeah, it's a complete protein, but it's not exactly a high quality source. Now, incomplete proteins, that's a protein that may or may not, that is a protein that does not have all of your essential amino acids. So these are going to be plant sources in general. Now, what you can do with incomplete proteins is you can create what is called a complementary protein. And a complementary protein is actually where you take two incomplete sources and put them together in order to kind of fill in each other's gaps. So beans are an incomplete protein, rice is an incomplete protein, but when they are consumed together, they complement each other to create a complete protein. So you can kind of see examples here. Animal sources are always complete, but if you add grains to legumes or grains to nuts or nuts to legumes, those things will fill in each other's gaps. And that's really important if you are on like a vegetarian or a vegan diet. That is actually where knowing your complementary protein sources is really important to ensure that you have like a full amino acid profile. So obviously, we know that protein intake is very important for cellular growth. And so we have a term for that we are going to call your nitrogen balance. I'd say in regards to protein lessons, this is the one big thing that's like definitely new. And I would definitely say this is probably the most important lesson for the protein section. So in order to facilitate growth in the human body, you have to maintain what we call a positive nitrogen balance. So if you think of the fact that like you're constantly destroying your body and constantly building it back up with food, there's this like constant like back and forth that's out. It's more, I guess it's not like this, it's more like a seesaw, right? You're like damaging your body and then you're repairing it, and you're damaging and you're repairing it, right? So if you damage it, you need to repair it with as much or more ingredients that it had from before in order to either grow the body or at least get it back to neutral, right? So that is what we refer to as a positive nitrogen balance. A positive nitrogen balance occurs when the dietary input of nitrogen, right, so that's protein, equals or exceeds the amount of nitrogen caused by cellular damage. Exceeds the output of so I'm sorry, I said exceeds the output of nitrogen in the form of cellular damage, right? So if you damage your body, you need to repair it, right? And this is where you're going to see protein. The AMDR is going to be anywhere from like 10 to 30% of protein intake. But I'm not actually going to put that up here because that's not one of the numbers we actually use very commonly. But the big number I do want you guys to kind of know is the recommended protein intake in order to maintain a positive nitrogen balance for a sedentary individual is 0.8 grams per kilogram of body weight per day. So if you are living a normal life and you consume this much protein, that should put you in a positive protein balance, and you shouldn't necessarily be unhealthy by like damaging any of your muscle more than you are repairing it. But if you're a strength athlete or a endurance athlete, or if you're trying to like gain muscle, right? Well, those numbers are going to go up. Instead of, if you are a strength athlete who's continually like damaging their muscles, you may need all the way up to 2 grams per kilogram of body weight. So suddenly your protein intake goes much, much higher. The more cellular damage you're creating through exercise, the more protein you're going to need. However, don't go crazy. I think that's a common mistake that people make. You'll hear people eat 1 gram per pound. There isn't like a lot of it. There's only so much protein synthesis your body can make. Eating more protein beyond that doesn't help your body synthesize any more protein. But it can be a safe way to ensure that, you're hedging your bets. You're never falling out of a positive nitrogen balance. So factors that are going to affect this include your current body weight. Obviously, the more you weigh, the more protein you have in your body, and therefore the more protein you're going to need. Your total energy intake. If you have like a high calorie diet, you want to make sure that you are sparing that protein as much as possible. So you might need a higher protein intake. If you're trying to lose or gain weight, right, both those are going to result in increased energy production, which means that you are damaging your body more, which means you're going to need more protein. And if you're not getting enough carbohydrates in your diet, you can actually eat protein, and then your body can go through the processes of gluconeogenesis to kind of make up for that. Although, I don't know, we're not a huge fan of doing it that way. Also the quality of your protein. If your protein quality sucks, you might need more of it. You're like, I'm getting enough protein in my diet every day. I don't know why I'm having such a hard time gaining muscle, but it's like that protein is McDonald's hamburgers. Ooh, I don't know, man. Like, you're getting grams of protein in, but those grams are not awesome. Your age can affect your protein intake, right? Obviously, like, younger athletes are going to have a higher protein requirement because their bodies are still developing, and so their body is constantly assembling new proteins to make a bigger and bigger body until growth finally stops. As we get older, we might actually need less, but for the most part, your total calories shouldn't really go over 35%. I think I said 10 to 30. I think I said 10 to 30%. It's 10 to 35% of your total calories should be protein. If it does exceed that, it can place additional stress on your kidneys. That doesn't necessarily mean it will damage them, but it does mean your kidneys will have to work more. It can also lead to dehydration, because remember, like, gluconeogenesis is part of hydrolysis, and so all of that water is going towards like breaking up your protein molecules, so that's not awesome. It does have a risk for cardiovascular disease and certain types of cancers. That's not the protein's fault, but it is like the protein source's fault. A lot of our sources are animal sources that are high in saturated fat, so now you've put yourself at risk for cardiovascular disease. And this is interesting. It can result in the excretion of calcium from your bones. Interestingly enough, it can actually deplete your calcium levels because you have too much protein in your body, because then calcium doesn't have a chance to be absorbed properly. So what are our good sources? Well, you can find protein in whole grains, brown rices, and whole wheat breads and pastas and things like that. Those aren't bad sources, but they're certainly not going to be very high in protein. Also, they are plant sources, so they're going to be incomplete. So you're going to want to pair those with something else if you do get your protein from sources like that. Fruits and vegetables, minimal amounts of protein there. I mean, broccoli actually has like a ton of protein in it, but you have to eat a lot of it to get it. So generally, our richest sources of protein are going to be things like dairy or dairy alternatives, milks, yogurts, cheddar, cheeses, and things like that. Protein-rich foods like meats, fish, poultry, eggs, and then plant sources such as legumes, nuts, and seeds. These are also really high in protein. So you're definitely not going to hear me say that you have to get your sources from animals. Like, I'm not a vegan or a vegetarian personally, but you're never also going to hear me say that that is necessarily a worse way of living. You can absolutely get plenty of protein and get plenty of amino acid profiles from those plant-based sources, but you do need to be aware of like how you are consuming those things and make sure that you're doing it right. And one thing that is also associated with a lot of meat products, and this is something, or animal products, that we're going to see tomorrow when we look at vitamins and minerals. There are certain vitamins, particularly vitamin B12, that really is found primarily in animal sources, and that is one of our essential vitamins. So a lot of times, like with my vegan clients and stuff, I will often suggest looking into possibly taking vitamin B12 supplement. Now, when it comes to protein claims, you do need to be a little cautious here. Good Lord, do we love protein, and we love to slap stickers on our food labels about protein. So you're going to see marketing claims that like protein has increased muscle capabilities or enhanced endurance, or it'll speed up your recovery. All of that could be true, but if you're not actually working out that hard, you're not going to get muscle just from eating protein. That's not how it works. And so we have this whole industry of bars and shakes and powders and pills. Now, I really like whey protein. I've found that it is a very effective supplement, and it is very good for muscle building. But that is because most people do not get enough protein in their diet. Could you do it without protein powder? Absolutely. You just have to make sure that you're actually getting it from whole sources. So there's obviously risk factors to consider. A lot of protein powders and stuff have a lot of artificial sweeteners in them, which I'm not a huge fan of. A lot of them will have certain chemical additives that have certain side effects. They'll often throw creatine in there, which is fine. Actually, creatine is not a bad supplement, but you should know that you're taking it. And so, sufficient protein is obviously required. We do know that. We want to be in a positive nitrogen balance if we are weight training. Don't get me wrong, protein's super important. But be cautious with certain like protein bars and things like that, because a lot of times they like to add things that make it taste really good, but are not necessarily healthy for you. So before exercise, make sure you get some protein so that will prevent catabolism during the activity. As you are doing all that excessive like training, your body is trying to produce energy. We want to make sure that it's not getting that energy from protein sources. So have some protein in your diet, but primarily make sure you have some carbohydrates in there as well. So 1 to 4 hours, try to get like a lean protein source, maybe 2 to 4 ounces. And then after exercise, try to ingest 6 to 20 grams of essential amino acids. And what I mean by that is 6 to 20 grams of protein that contain lots of essential amino acids. So if you can get 6 to 20 grams of protein from like a whey protein powder, that's actually a really good source. I'm a big fan. But generally, when it comes to like eating your meals, you want at least 15 grams of good protein. Within, they're saying 3 hours of exercise, there is a lot of evidence to suggest